start to share my screen.
Let me introduce you first. George Richardson is our speaker today. Not only is he a world-class system dynamics modeler, but he has been a great friend and mentor to many of us in K-12 for decades, and he is so kind in his mentoring that it has always brought us forward in very positive ways. He is a wonderful guitar player, and he has ridden his motorcycle across Canada to Alaska. And so he also rides motorcycles, but he is here to talk to us about getting started on the right foot with system dynamics modeling. And we should listen carefully to what he says.
Begin with a little guitar.
Maybe at the end, after we're all on the questions and answers. No, he will present. Go ahead.
My study is also my music room. So
we will have his presentation first. Emre and I will look at the chat to see if there are any questions for which we need to interrupt his presentation. His presentation is in the neighborhood of 45 minutes, and then we will have formal questions and answers afterwards for as long as you want to ask questions. So it may go beyond an hour. We will allow that to happen.
Okay.
Okay, George, go ahead.
Then I will share my screen. And there I am. Now I have to move this little widget around. There we go. That's me and what the wonderful title that Diana gave me. I have various subtitles. And the talk begins with where I began. Students come to us knowing nothing about feedback loops in human affairs. Oops, sorry. They know very little about modeling. They're inexperienced in systems thinking or confused. They're unaware of stocks. They're ignorant or confused about what nonlinear means. Actually, that's true for most of the planet. Inexperienced in computer simulation, completely ignorant of the endogenous point of view, which if you know me at all in written work, you know that's very important to me and a key feature of our field. Furthermore, they have no idea what a system dynamics model actually looks like, because I've seen some of the things that students produce in the name of system dynamics models. And that's what gave me the idea for this talk. This talk is about what good work in our field actually looks like. What looks like a feedback loop, but isn't. What looks like a system dynamics model, but isn't. And where I'm going with this is all of us listening to this are aiming for understandings of our field, not just for graduate students, but that we can present at the very beginning. So I'm going to begin with a question that comes from Sesame Street, if you remember those things. You know, they used to say, which of these things is not like the others? And there'd be a variety of things on the screen. So I'm starting the same way with feedback loops, and I'm saying, which of these loops is not like the others? By the way, I hate talking and not being able to have you guys shout out your answers. So I will just have to go on. I'm going to assume that people responded, and some of you said, well, actually, I think that one. But in fact, that's not a feedback loop, or actually a set of 3 feedback loops, because those arrows mean and then. We start with some understandings of the system, and then we conceptualize or map the system. And then we build understandings of a model, which we then test and understand it. Then that may lead to new understandings or an entirely new conceptualization, and then blah, blah, blah. This is a picture of a sequence of steps in the modeling process. It's not a set of feedback loops. So I hope I didn't fool anyone with that. But if I did, you now know that people can draw diagrams like this that look like feedback loops that aren't. Now here, this is also not a set of feedback loops. The arrows here actually represent flows of material, and the words represent stocks. Actually, I've left out carbon in water in the oceans. That's because this came from an early classroom exercise. The arrows represent flows. This is a view of the carbon cycle minus the oceans. It's not a causal diagram. It's actually a stock and flow diagram in a very unusual form. So there you go. Only this one is a feedback loop. And I hope you saw it. This is a very compelling and important self-reinforcing story about prejudice. Prejudice leads to discrimination, which limits opportunities for the minority, which limits their achievements, which further reinforces the prejudice of the majority that they are superior. First written up in 1944 in Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma. By the way, it's still an American dilemma, and appears in Robert King Merton's very famous self-fulfilling prophecy article in the 40s. They look alike, but only one of them is a feedback loop. I hope you're with me. Now, Alan, here you are. Alan is one of the creators of connection circles, Alan and Rob, and this tool has migrated all around the world. This particular example was an environmental connection circle that I saw when I was out in St. Louis at a school, how can I say this? A conference of teachers and students, school students. Beside that diagram was this causal loop diagram. It was right next to it. You've got evaporation and condensation, and each of these influences the next by changing in the same direction. And I want to mention, and this is where this is leading, as Alan would urge, it's really excellent practice to pull out one or more well-formed feedback loops from connection circles. So here's the idea. The connection circle helps us uncover feedback loops. And even though the words are written on a circle, it's really not a feedback loop. We would want to pull out from it, in this case, evaporation, condensation, precipitation. You can see that there's evaporation, condensation, and then something going into clouds, which I haven't shown, and precipitation, which I faked. And then we get water on the ground and we're back up here to evaporation. So you really want students to do this. And by the way, when I was out in St. Louis, there was a teacher who was watching one of her students present to me, and the student had done this, and the teacher was scared to death because she thought pulling out a feedback loop was wrong. And I had to pat the student on the back and pat the teacher on the back because they had done it just right. But by itself, it's important to realize a connection circle is not a feedback loop. It's a tool. So I went to the feedback loop that they had drawn, and I added helpful comments. So evaporation leads to actually to water vapor in the atmosphere. It condenses into clouds, and water precipitates. And eventually, I just rearranged those same words. Water on the ground evaporates, water vapor in the atmosphere, it condenses. This should actually say water in clouds, precipitation, and so on. Now, I've changed okay. So it's just the same loop rearranged. And some of you may see where I'm going with this. There are three things in that loop that are actually stocks: water vapor in the atmosphere, water in the clouds, and water on the ground. And you'll notice I've changed the S's to pluses because for things I've written about 30 years ago or more, S's don't work very well with stocks, but pluses do. Water on the ground adds to evaporation, which adds to water vapor in the atmosphere, and so on. Okay, so we've seen that CLD had hidden stocks. And if you represent this in Stella, you get a picture that looks like this. Same words, but now we've got clear pipes and clear stocks. I hope that's vividly familiar to you all. So the important idea here is that the links in that CLD before are flows. They're not causal influences. We wouldn't call this thing in front of you right here a feedback loop. It's actually a closed loop of water moving around in the system. It's certainly not reinforcing. We don't get more water by having it flow around among those boxes. So the important idea here, because I think a lot of you use connection circles are great tools for getting started, but they aren't systems thinking by themselves. We have to pull out of them what we have uncovered by the links that we've drawn. So systems thinking is, I think, on the right, or at least going in that direction. Incidentally, notice that the circle around here, that was just a place where to put the words. It actually doesn't figure in any of the arrows. Worth noting. So I think either of these is okay, as long as we both realize they're telling conserved flow stories. Water is being conserved around this sequence. And neither one of them is a reinforcing loop. We're not getting more water by watching it move around. Of course, California is getting more water on the ground, but that's a different story. And the one on the left probably communicates the best, but it depends on your audience. Now, we are trying to talk about what strong work in our field actually looks like. So I want to talk now about what a well-structured system dynamics model actually looks like. And remember, students come to us not knowing anything about feedback, not knowing anything about modeling, don't know anything about systems thinking. They don't know about stocks from Adam. They have no idea about nonlinearity. They don't probably, well, they may have some experience with computer simulation, completely ignorant of endogeneity, and they have no idea when they first walk into your class, what does a system dynamics model look like? So if the teacher said, okay, kids, build a system dynamics model of blip, population, say, they have no idea what to do. So we have to show what insightful modeling looks like. I'll show you a model about students becoming interested in system dynamics modeling. That was the case I picked. I won't show you how to create it. I'll just show you what a well-structured model actually looks like. you want your models to look like this one, and you want your students' models to look like this too. So we're talking about what good system dynamics models actually look like. Eventually, I'll show you a couple of pictures of things your models should not look like, but those are instructive too. So here is, I think, a well-structured system dynamics model of students becoming interested in system dynamics and teachers teaching them, and students leave the system after having studied it for a while, and students create a load on teachers and so on. Here, let's build it up. Students are becoming interested because other students are talking to them. That's the feedback loop on the left. And students graduating, they leave after a certain amount of time. Students per teacher is pretty obvious. And then I divided it by a normal students per teacher, so that relative student load per teacher is somewhere below 1 or above 1. If it's above 1, there's too many students. If it's below 1, there's fewer than we can get away with. And after a time, that effective teacher load influences the quality of the experience, and that should influence student word of mouth. So we end up with a large feedback loop there that has 2 stocks in it. You okay? All right. Now, here's how it behaves. This is a feature of Vensim that allows me to put the graphs right on the map itself. By the way, I'll be getting later to Vensim and Stella, so hang in there if you're not familiar with these diagrams. So here's the story that the model tells. Teachers start teaching a few students system dynamics. There's the arrow pointing to just a few students. Students like it and tell others. So word of mouth is high and positive, and it's great. They're attracting students. More students get involved. Eventually, we have a lot of students studying system dynamics, or relatively a lot. Whoops. Eventually, we get too many, so that the effective teacher load has risen probably way above where we want it to be. And that overload causes students to lose, well, they're not having a good time. Here's what you should note about, now, what I'm saying now is generic. Pressures for change emerge from stocks. The number of students get us this teacher load per student. As students change, that load changes. It pushes that load. And the effective teacher load influences how happy students are in the classroom. Are they happy because think they're learning a ton, or there's just too many of them and the teacher has too little time for them? So pressures of change for change emerge from stocks. And another way to say that is stocks are the sources of dynamics. You and I are used to thinking of feedback loops as the sources of dynamics. No, it's actually stocks. That's where pressures for change comes from. Flows identify what's changing. And I think equations can be obvious and maybe should be. For example, I bet most of you can tell me that students per teacher is students divided by teachers using system dynamics. Yeah. And I told you what this one was, just because I wanted this to be, instead of this being 45, I liked it to be around 1. And effective teacher load lasts over time. So I model it as a stock. It's a funny kind of stock. Here it's modeled as it's a smooth. So we don't bother showing the pipe because nothing's really flowing into it. This is the only time a blue arrow goes into a stock. So there you go. That's what you should notice about this well-structured model. You may not like the model. I don't care. But it's what our work ought to look like. I'm having trouble with my watch. It won't show me what time. Oh, there it is. Okay. All right. The model has minor flaws. We could talk about that. What do students know after they see this and preferably play with it? They know a little bit about feedback loop in human affairs. In particular, you run this model and initial success turns bad because of a feedback loop. They know a little bit about modeling dynamic feedback systems. That picture is the correct syntax of a model diagram. Stocks, they don't have to be orange. Flows and feedback loops. That's the syntax. They have some awareness of stocks. Stocks are the sources of pressure for change. And they're beginning to get the idea of an endogenous point of view, although we didn't mention it. The point is, nobody told the students to stop coming. The dynamics in that system come from the internal structure of the system where teachers get overloaded. That's the beginnings of the endogenous point of view, which is so crucial to our field. And the whole thing is a good idea what a well-structured system dynamics model actually looks like. Here, now this points to something I'm going to talk about in a little bit. Do you see another potential stock here? And here again, I would love to be able to have people shout out their answers. I bet you're suggesting that, come on now, I gotta think, that teachers using system dynamics could be, teachers using system dynamics could be a stock. And if you wanted to, you could add the structure that would allow that stock to change as they got more students. So there it is. System dynamics students, teachers required, some of them becoming interested, not all of them will. Takes time to become skilled. This becomes teachers using system dynamics. And here's how it behaves. The red graphs are the original simulation where the system collapsed. The blue graphs are when we've allowed the teachers using system dynamics to, this is funny, by the way, I'm raising my arms, I'm gesturing, and I can't see any of you. We're getting more teachers, so the load doesn't rise so high. So teachers stay effective. Well, yeah, they've got a lot to do, but students still like it, and students are still becoming interested. So it actually changes the structure over time. Fixing language, I gave this presentation to my Thursday group of my friends, and they didn't like graduating. No, they probably complete the course. It's probably the current teacher load, but I didn't want to fix the words because, as you can see, there's a lot of diagrams in here and I have to change all of them. Here's another well-structured one. You should see it looks the same. It's got flows into stocks. It's got feedback loops that originate from stocks. And sobering goes like that. That's an unusual one, but it's okay. By the way, I spelled alcohol wrong. My mother used to make, she was an amazing knitter. And she always felt that everything she made ought to have a little mistake in it, because that's how you knew it was handmade. So this is how you know I did this. I misspelled alcohol. This model is very instructive. You could play with it with your kids. They want to get buzzed, so they drink, and they get alcohol in their tummy, and it flows into alcohol in the bloodstream. This is where the buzz comes from. And eventually that alcohol in the bloodstream disappears, and we're fine. In another view, here's this quote unquote desired buzz. I didn't know what to call that. And here's alcohol in the tummy, which disappears as you digest things. And here's alcohol in the bloodstream. And note that that's where you're alcohol impaired. You're more than buzzed. Not good. Now, imagine having a little model like this that you could talk with your students about if they're at the level of doing unwise drinking. You got parameters you can change. You might have other things you could change. Things to avoid. I've seen diagrams that look like this. I'll show you some. Barry Richmond called this kind of thing causal mishmash. Unclear arithmetic, unclear causality. And note that the stock is sitting there. No arrows are coming from this. Notice in our previous things, arrows always come from the stocks. Look at that. Look at that. More things to avoid. Flows usually flow into stocks. They usually don't cause other things, although I showed you an arrow that did go rate to rate. Now, this is student work, also out at St. Louis. And here's a thing to avoid. See this over here? You got, let me go back. You got jealousy, parents, trust, friends, disagreements, suspicion, all kinds of things flowing into this inflow called relationships. It's causal mishmash. You have no idea how you'd write an equation for that, and you don't know how they combine, but you do know the students are trying to think about it. And in this case, notice that relationships don't do anything in this map. There's no causal arrow that comes out of relationships. It's an unused stock. And of course, you could do the same thing on the right. Here, the students are very close to having it right. Here, look, pressures are coming from the stock. The arrows originate from tension, and they get fights and family problems and fear of the future. And down below, you got some more things: bullying, failure, boyfriend, girlfriend, drama, and so on. Feedback loops go from stock to flow to stock. These guys are getting it. It's not perfect yet, but they're closer. And here's a picture from a student who'd actually had a lot of stuff and thought really hard about how newcomers in system dynamics become mature system dynamicists. And there's this massive array of exogenous influences. That's not us. We want to derive the dynamics from the internal structure of the system. All right, this is my last major part of this talk. This comes from my personal experience. How do you get students to create something like this? Here's a plan that will work. There's 4 stages to this plan. I call the first stage C, or explore. And by the way, this is the way I teach my graduate students. I start with existing models. I lead them through them, and we talk about them. They're not building them. We are playing. In fact, I'm playing and they're commenting. Then I give them an exercise in which I give them a model to copy. For example, you could give them a Vensim model, simple, and tell them to build the Stella model from that. Now, by the way, I did that in the early stages of my teaching because that's where I was. I was moving away from Stella, moving into Vensim, and so I gave the students the Stella model and had them build the Vensim model from it. My students told me that was one of the most instructive exercises I gave in the entire course. They weren't inventing anything. They were just getting a model to run correctly. They knew they had all the equations, and they would make typographical errors and fiddle around, and then they'd have to try to figure out why. So the exercise of copying a model is very powerful, and they don't have to know anything except how to write equations. The next category of things is I called play. Experiment with existing models. Now, one kind of assignment is give them a model that has a mistake in it somewhere. You've divided instead of multiplied. You've done some, and their task is to find the mistake and fix it, get it to make sense, get the model to make sense. Now, they're starting with a model that's almost all there. It's just got a mistake in it. So they're still not building their own model. Then a middle category is model, what I call a canned model description. Give them a text. In fact, I almost always gave them text about an epidemic. And sentences in that text were equations. I didn't have to say that, but that was evident. And then the last in this category is to take a model that works, like the students and teachers in system dynamics, and add structure, like the structure that brought on more teachers when we got too many students. I used to give exactly that kind of structure. Now, this is nice because it's students have to figure out what to add and how to write the equations to say what they want to say. Think is the third category. Learn how modelers think and think like that. That's actually model conceptualization. It's a whole other story. If Diana invites me again, I'll try to talk about that at this same level. But certainly it involves having a problem, sketching graphs over time, inventing simple feedback loops that we call the dynamic hypothesis, trying to get arithmetic right in a model, and so on. Learn how modelers think and think like that. This is the hard part, of course. And then finally, by the way, I give them a model conceptualization exercise, but don't ask them to build a model. This is actually at the very end of the course. Finally, getting students ready to work on personally chosen problems. I give them a problem with familiar dynamics and structure, but it's a blank page. Now, in fact, I've often used fish banks, the in-class simulation exercise that's now on the web. It's ideal. They've all played with exactly the same model. So they know they've played with the same system. They don't know the model. So they know what's going on. And now they have to try to write equations for it. Incidentally, it's even got another feature that's nice. That exercise has sort of two levels. One is you could just, if you've played fish banks, you know that it's a fishing exercise where there's a coast and a deep sea. Well, they can just build the model in the coast. That's what this picture is. And then they can add the deep sea, which is much more complicated. Almost everybody can do this. Some can do that. Now, I want to tell you why I'm doing this. Benefits of copying models, focusing on an existing, well-formulated piece of model structure, attention to details of formulation and equation writing. That is, they can see equations. They didn't have to write them. Focusing on finding errors, making a model work before modeling skills are developed. And students are beginning to get the idea that, wait a sec, I see how these things go together. I may be able to do this. Benefits of adding structure. You've got a model that makes sense and runs. That a teacher, system dynamics students and teacher model made sense and runs. Add a few equations that have to be created. And the beauty of that is you add an equation and you get an error that says everything went to infinity, or you got negative people or whatever. And so students get really fast simulation-based feedback. They're taking small steps toward actual modeling. They're working towards starting with a blank page, and they're growing. Furthermore, in our field, we iterate when we build models. We build a small piece, populate it with numbers, simulate, see how it behaves, carry that understanding to the next level. That's iterative model building. So the benefits, you can begin simple, builds understanding, carries understanding from one iteration to the next. You can use models that students are playing with that come from core models in our field. Epidemics, everybody should see an epidemic model. The most modeled part of our field is project modeling. They can play with a project model. Population modeling heads in the direction of limits to growth. And it accumulates confidence in modeling at each stage, grows understandings, emphasizes always having a running model. So this is the plan that I have used. By the way, I frequently have used the Kaibob model when I'm just handing the model to them, and we talk about it together. I unfold it for them, we simulate it, we play, and so on. Experiment with existing models. There they are, thinking hard at any one of these. And there's our little model. And it's got the version where they're adding structure to an existing model. Learn how modelers think. Yeah, we conceptualize, we start with dynamics in everything we do. And of course, everybody knows that I tell jokes through all of my presentations, and I've gotten this far with only a couple minutes left. And it's my first joke. Here's where we went wrong. And of course, that's not where we went wrong. And I love to ask my students, where did they go wrong? And of course, it's part way up that increasing curve on the left. That's where problems were developing. We think dynamically, but we try not to make jokes. And eventually, by the end of this course, students are getting a chance to try it themselves. And this, by the way, happens to be the project model that I develop in class and give my students to fix and so on. Now I'm done. I will stay as long as you want. You should know that, thank you, Kim, for raising your hand. I just see a note that says that. I talked about two things. One was, a little bit about loops, a lot of it about what well-structured models look like, and then how do we get our students there? And my claim is we get them there by giving them stuff at the beginning and adding challenge very gradually. I think this is a kind way of teaching system dynamics. I don't give them a problem they can't do at any stage along the way.